I'm with Adam Levick from Camera UK. Now, Adam, what is Camera UK?
Camera UK is the UK branch of the US based organization Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis. It was an organization established in 1982 to combat biased reporting about Israel and to promote accurate reporting about Israel. We operate in four languages. That is, we monitor the media in four languages: English, Spanish, Arabic, and Hebrew. Again, we have a lot of staff in North America, maybe about 50, about eight of us in the Jerusalem office where I work from. But Camera UK, we take our mission and apply it to the British media. And we try to get British media outlets to report more accurately about Israel. And specifically, we have a very unique strategy, and that is we go directly to the journalists and to the editors. And when we see bad coverage or inaccurate coverage, we try to get them to uphold their own editorial standards. So when we see an inaccuracy, we try to convince them to correct it. And we've had a lot of success over the years. Camera UK usually gets about 50 corrections each year. As an organization, I think we surpassed 260 corrections overall in four languages last year. So our goal is efficacy. And we try not just to complain about British media bias, but to do something about it. And I think we make a big difference.
So you actually challenge the editors when they get things wrong?
We do. Yeah. I mean, most British outlets have some sort of complaint system. Some of them are members of IPSO, the Independent Press Standards Organization, in which case they're accountable to that body. Even if they're not, most British outlets have some sort of complaint system where they will respond to your complaints. But it depends. Sometimes it's easier just to go on Twitter and to tweet to journalists to get them to correct something. Again, most of the times they don't correct, but we have had a lot of success with corrections, either by using their online correction forum or contacting the editor or journalists or flagging it on social media. And we have various ways depending on the media outlet. Some media outlets are more stubborn than other media outlets, but we find that it makes a difference. We find that, once they correct a false claim, they're less likely to make that false claim again in the future. So, it's not revolutionary, but it does make a difference. And that's something that we're committed to is, all the time, but especially given the immense scrutiny of Israel following the October 7th massacre.
Now, Israel is at war with Hamas at the moment since the 7th of October terror attack. How has journalism in the UK been?
There's been some exceptions, but it's been really bad, even by the standards we're used to. We've found that media outlets that are typically hostile to Israel have only doubled down since October 7th, instead of kind of recalibrating their coverage in light of what was on that day the worst anti-Semitic massacre since the Holocaust. They've only seemed to intensify their pro-Palestinian bias and their anti-Israel bias. And we're seeing what I would describe as inversions, where there's almost very little coverage of Hamas, very little mention of their anti-Semitic and genocidal charter, very little coverage. There's been some, but very little, relatively speaking, coverage of the increasingly well-reported documentation of Hamas atrocities on October 7th, which includes just horrific things that are hard to watch, but even hard to explain, but mass rapes, torture, mutilation, just all manner of brutality and barbarism on that day. And, this is the most well-documented atrocity probably in history because, as Hamas filmed themselves and, used GoCams to record what they were doing on that day. So, whereas I think the story should be just, that never again, that, what people espouse when they say that never are we going to allow Jews to suffer what they suffered during the Holocaust, we found that that's really, that people oftentimes don't mean it. It's just a cliche. And, if you're someone who promotes the idea that racism is a bad thing and that anti-Semitism is a bad thing and should be fought rather, then clearly the response of October 7th should be to sympathize with 1,200 Israeli victims and with their families, and as there's still over 100 Israelis still held captive by the terrorists in Gaza. So we find that media outlets have lost interest almost immediately with the story of the massacre and have instead focused on Israel's response to the massacre, which I would argue is proportional to what most Western democracies would do if their population suffered a similar attack. And, instead, as usual, media outlets are promoting a double standard, treating Israel in a way that they would never treat or report on any other Western democracy that suffered such a monstrous attack. So it's been unfortunate, but unfortunately, most of these media outlets have not risen to the occasion and are allowing their own biases to cloud their coverage.
What sort of misrepresentation are you seeing?
Oh, I mean, there's all sorts, but for instance, taking Hamas's claims at face value, right? Now, Hamas has been releasing these supposed casualty numbers that has been, they claim has been collected from their Ministry of Health in Gaza. And I think it's just common sense that when you have a group that's a prescribed terror group in the UK, that media outlets should take their claims, all claims, with, a lot of skepticism. But instead, what we're seeing is the greater skepticism towards Israeli claims. For instance, when Hamas releases these so-called casualty numbers, they never mention how many of these fatalities were Hamas terrorists. So it's impossible for the public, for news consumers, to understand what these numbers even mean. I mean, if a large number of those killed have been terrorists, then that is evidence that Israel has been very careful in their attacks and is only going after Hamas. But the impression left by the media outlets' complete refusal to critically scrutinize those numbers is that Israel is attacking Palestinian civilians, which is not true. Now, sadly, some civilians get killed unintentionally, as they do in all Western wars. But the message that the British media has largely been wedded to is that Israel is wantonly bombing Gaza or indiscriminately bombing Gaza, which is simply not true. And so that's one thing. Then you can go to specific incidents. The reported bombing of the Al-Ahi hospital in October, which media outlets consistently got wrong. They based, again, just like the fatality statistics, they based that reporting that Israel bombed a hospital, killing supposedly 500 people, which was later turned out to be completely false. They based it entirely on Hamas claims. So what we're seeing is a pattern of British media outlets giving sometimes more weight to Hamas claims than Israeli claims, and treating Hamas as if it's a normal government rather than an anti-Semitic extremist organization who's dedicated to the murder of Jews. And I think that's in addition to being a professional failure, I think that's a moral failure. It's a moral failure on the part of journalists who should know better and who, in any other situation in the world, would take what these extremist groups say with a grain of salt. So we're seeing, though there are some exceptions, we're seeing overall just this refusal to really seriously scrutinize Hamas and those organizations that support Hamas.
Why do you think we have bad journalism when it comes to Israel?
Look, that's a really complicated question, but I think a lot of it stems from these radical ideas that have filtered their way from universities into the media. And one of the ideas is that, humanity is neatly divided into oppressed and oppressors. And they have been so conditioned to believe that Israel is the oppressor and Palestinians are the oppressed that they really have a hard time coping with the cognitive dissonance of events like October 7th. So, so they've been reporting to their readers and their viewers that Palestinians are the oppressed victims. And when groups like Islamic Jihad or Hamas or Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade or any other Palestinian extremist group engages in just the wanton slaughter of Jewish civilians, they don't know how to frame that, right? Because it's inconsistent with the paradigm that they've been filtering the conflict within for years. And again, so I think it's a moral failure, an intellectual failure, and a failure of imagination. I mean, I think the natural reaction for most informed journalists after October 7th would be to re-examine the premise of their reporting. Wow, to say that maybe Israel is right to have such strict security controls at the Gaza border. Maybe Israel is right to be skeptical of Palestinian intentions. But instead, many of them have doubled down. There's an Israeli writer by the name of Shani Moore, who wrote an article, an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal, who referred to the way that journalists have avoided reckoning with October 7th as a cognitive dissonance avoidance. That is, instead of really grappling with the inconsistency of their views with what happened on that day, they've decided to just double down on their original biases. And I think when you fail to adapt to new situations, when you fail to adapt to new information, and instead just push that new information away, then I think you're engaged in just a serious error, and it ends up that readers or people who count on your expertise are grossly misled. So again, I think it comes down to this binary good and evil, and which intuitively you would think that Hamas would be the ones that would be seen as evil. But since I think media outlets have a hard time distinguishing Palestinians from Palestinian extremists, they kind of put Hamas still in this victim category, despite how extremist they are, despite how anti-Semitic they are, and they just have a hard time reconciling their narrative with Palestinian extremism. So I think some of it's maybe some of it, depending on the journalist, is motivated by pure old-fashioned anti-Semitism, but I think much of it is just this failure to understand that the dynamics within this region are far different than the way that they've been reporting.
Who's the worst in all of this? Who's the worst journalist? Who's the worst organization?
The Guardian is by far the worst media outlet in the UK. Now, you could argue that the BBC has more influence than the Guardian, so I think the BBC probably does more harm than the Guardian in terms of just their reach. They're a global media outlet that operates in dozens of languages. But I would say if you're asking me which media outlet based in the UK, which mainstream outlet based in the UK has been the worst, it's been the Guardian. They have not, I would, again, I'm not saying that they're pro-Hamas, but I think their coverage is effectively pro-Hamas. And, for instance, we've documented that they have just, completely, bending any sense of moral norms. They've accused Israel in some form or another, either by implication or direct accusation. They've accused Israel, not Hamas, of engaging in ethnic cleansing or genocide in their counterattack on Gaza. Just complete inversion of reality, right? I mean, Hamas is the one with the genocidal charter. Hamas is the one that has been openly clear that when they get the chance, they're going to repeat October 7th again and again. And yet they are just completely promoting the idea that it's evil, that it's Israel that is the malevolent force, and that it's Israel who is the greatest threat to the region. They're both their contributors and their journalists are just unabashedly anti-Israel, and they've used this recent war to only, reinforce that view. I mean, there's no media outlet that has more of a visceral institutional hostility towards Israel than The Guardian.
BBC is the state broadcaster. We've already mentioned them. How are they?
Look, they've been bad. And I said, like when I said, like when you asked me which media outlet was the worst, I could have said BBC just because of their reach, the global reach. But just to give you some examples, they still refuse to call Hamas a terror organization in their own language. They still refuse to call, terrorists that have been killed by Israel by using the word terrorists. This is a long-standing policy which BBC initially tried to defend, but there's no indication that they're going to, amend their policy to instruct journalists to consistently use the word terrorist, even though, as you know, Hamas is a proscribed terrorist organization in the UK. So there's that. Then there's also just inadequate coverage of the UK protests. As you know, every week, if not more often, there have been anti-Israel protests in the UK, much of which has been anti-Semitic, much of which has been pro-terrorism, pro-intifada, with chants of from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And the BBC has whitewashed this. They've reported, by and large, these protests as if they were peaceful protests, and they're not. So, this is clearly indicative of a anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian agenda. And, anyone who goes on Twitter and sees photos and videos of the protests in real time can see that these are, I would say these are hate marches. There was the former UK Home Secretary got in trouble for calling them hate marches, but I think they are hate marches. And the fact that the BBC is covering for these extremists is really disturbing, and I think really doesn't serve the interests of BBC News consumers. Then there's also, they were the worst when it comes to reporting on that Al-Ali hospital explosion. And if you might recall, or at least some of your listeners might recall, John Donison, the veteran BBC reporter, on air said that it couldn't be anything other than an Israeli strike. And BBC is still presenting the incident as contested when, as we know, there is a virtual agreement by all parties that have investigated that explosion that it was a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket that caused that explosion, an errant rocket, and that the number of casualties, which Hamas reported to be 500, was way over what the number of casualties actually were. So it was a complete false story. It was completely false news, and the BBC has never really atoned properly for their misreporting. And that this was misreporting that spread across the globe, that resulted in anti-Israel protests. It resulted in a Tunisian synagogue being burned down. There was a riot that was based in part on that false story. So here we have BBC, this UK-based global media corporation peddling false news to, God knows how many viewers. Right. So there's that, which they never adequately addressed. And then there's generally their unbalanced coverage. For instance, they have stopped reporting on Hamas rocket attacks on Israel weeks ago. Those of us who live in Israel know that though the rocket barrage from Gaza isn't what it was in the first few weeks, presumably because the IDF took out a lot of their rocket launchers and rocket bases, there's still consistently rocket attacks on Israel. BBC has decided that it's not a story, that there are hundreds of thousands of Israelis displaced from their homes from both the south and the north, because as you know, there's been Hezbollah attacks from the north since the beginning of the war, and many Israeli towns have been evacuated. Not to mention the Israelis evacuated from the south. So they've completely ignored, when they talk about the plight of Gaza civilians, they ignore the plight of Israeli civilians, not just those directly impacted by October 7th, but those impacted by the fact that they have been scattered all over Israel because they can't safely live in their homes. So we see these 4 points, I would say, consistently in their coverage. And the fact that they're funded by British license fee payers, I think, means that they are, if anything, are more accountable than an outlet like The Guardian, who can basically do whatever they want. But the BBC's, as you know, a public trust. They are accountable to the British people, and they are not, reporting in a way that's consistent with their own editorial standards.
Who are the best reporters in the UK?
The Telegraph has been consistently very good. They've really decided to buck the trend and not only report accurately about what's going on in Gaza and what's going on in Israel in terms of the war, but they've been really good about exposing extremism in the UK, exposing the extremism within these anti-Israel marches, exposing extremists who use their position within academia or some other field to bash Israel and to promote anti-Semitism. They've also been good about holding the BBC and other biased outlets to account. So, if I was in the UK, I definitely would be reading the Telegraph. The Times has been, better than average. But yeah, I'd say by far the Telegraph has been the most morally clear, the most accurate, and the most willing to call out people who are supporting an organization that's prescribed by the British government.
One of the new kids on the block is GB News. How are they?
Yeah, I don't cover them. We usually go by tips, right? So we get very few complaints about GB News. And from what I've seen, they've been pretty good. So I'm not an expert on the network, but anecdotally from what our supporters, kind of tell us and the tips we get about ours, they've been doing pretty well.
Is a lot of false reporting a form of anti-Semitism, do you think?
I don't know if it's a form of anti-Semitism, but let's put it this way. It definitely has an anti-Semitic impact. As I'm sure you know and many of your listeners know, since October 7th, there's been an unprecedented spike in anti-Semitic incidents in the UK and also in other major cities in the West. And much of this anti-Semitism, I would say, is incited or fueled by this horrible, horrible reporting by media outlets, which paint Israel out to be some monster. And we see this all the time whenever there is some sort of war or conflict between Israel and Hamas or Israel and Islamic Jihad. Media outlets, that are biased against Israel use the most sensational headlines, the most sensational accusations. And this, in turn, fuels and incites those in the UK that are already prone to be anti-Semitic and you cannot, really engage in a serious conversation about anti-Semitism in the UK unless you're willing to talk about the role played by the media in fueling it. So while the reporting is, look, reporters and media outlets are free to report because they're in a country that is open and free and supports free speech. There is no question that their actions, their individual decisions, and the decisions by editors to paint the most sensational picture, impute the worst faith to Israel, and go with the worst charges, legitimize the worst charges, definitely fuels anti-Semitism in the UK, and they need to be held account for this. One recent example is there was a report in multiple media outlets based on an unverified claim that Israeli snipers shot 2 Christians in a church complex in Gaza. Now, after less than a day, Israel flatly denied that they were anywhere near that facility or that they killed anybody. But this was picked up by multiple media outlets. It was an allegation that was accepted as true by the Vatican, and it prompted a rebuke of Israel by the Pope. And yet media outlets, didn't even report it, many of them, as a claim. They reported it as a fact. And there's, if you want to get people all riled up, sure, tell them that Israeli snipers are murdering Christians, innocent Christians. And again, it's not true, but it's reported there was just a willingness by some media outlets and editors and journalists just to take the most sensational accusation, despite the dearth of evidence, and report it as fact. And this is a perfect example of how media misreporting about Israel can fuel anti-Semitism.
So, citizens who support Israel, can they report what they see to you and then you will deal with it and look into it?
Absolutely. If they're on Twitter, they can tweet us and they can send us an email at info@camera-uk.org. I'm happy to, again, if you want to share my personal email address in your show notes, I'm happy to do that. We rely entirely on, not entirely, but we rely quite a bit on tips from our listeners and from our readers. And so there are also a lot of people out there, I know friends, family, who just want to do something to defend Israel, something to help Israel during this horrific situation that we're in. And the best thing that they can do is flag and send our way examples of inaccurate reporting. So we welcome that. We rely on that. And any information those who follow your show can give us would be appreciated.
What's your website for people who'd like to know more?
Camera.org is the main site. That's the parent organization, camera.org. You can find us at camera.uk.org. And from there, you can, get links to our social media channels. We're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, we're on Facebook and YouTube. But I'd say if they want to just go to the main page at camera.org, it's easy to remember, camera.org. And from there, you can find all of our sister sites and follow us on social media.
Okay, Adam, well, thank you very much for sharing today.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.